morning. My name is Wilfred Savoie. Here I am in beautiful Albert County Museum to have a little chat with my good friend. I would like to introduce to you Mrs. Dawne McLean. She is a retired teacher whose interest is mainly in the history of this region. She was probably involved in one way or another in every community activity that went on in this region. We have decided to do this interview so we can get to know her better and to pick her brain also as to a piece of history of the area. Don, I will be basically asking you two questions. First, why this interest in Acadian history of the area? And secondly, I'd like to have just a little chat to you about what happened after the Acadians left here. And let's start with the first question. I know that that you're instrumental in getting the Acadian part of this museum, and you are also working on our working group for the Chipoudie Monument. Why this interest in Acadian history of this region?
Okay, Wilfred, well, to start, naturally with the World Congress coming up, we thought this museum definitely should have an Acadian exhibit because the Acadians are a very important part of the history of this area. Myself, the interest has stemmed for many years because I grew up in Chipoudie. My family, my father's family, the Wright family, I'm the sixth generation. We've lived in Chipoudie all of that time, except when I was away at university. Of course, I had to leave Chipoudie for a little while, but I soon came back. Okay, and even my address today, even though I'm married and we built a new home, it's not obviously where I grew up as a child, but it's not that far up the road. So I grew up living, you might say, behind our house. I could look at the marshes. As a child, we went out and picked greens, goose tongue greens, on my bicycle with my friend, and we would pedal around selling our goose tongue greens. Samphire greens were delicious. We knew the tides. My great uncle had been a lightkeeper on Grindstone Island, and I knew he even left to go on his boat out to the island off of one of the creeks in Chipoudie Marsh. So the marsh is a very wonderful habitat, and that was exactly why the Acadians settled here. So in my family, they're very historic. In fact, my grandfather's house was like a museum, okay? We knew that the Acadians had lived there. I grew up hearing the stories, knowing that they had lived there. So it was just part, and I think it's very special to know that where you lived, you were on the same area that people had lived there hundreds of years ago. And interesting enough, Chipoudie, where the village de Savoie, so here I am talking to Wilfred Savoie, and I lived in Chipoudie, where your ancestors lived, okay? And an interesting thing that we have to talk about is this griststone that's behind you, because it is actually from the Thibodeau grist mill. It's the only artifact we have that the Acadians were there. And my great-grandfather, James Wright, and his neighboring friend went up the brook. They had the idea, everyone reused things, right? Well, Henry Tingley had a shingle mill, and he must have had a reason why he thought this grist mill, or this griststone, would be usable, as well as probably there might have been machinery he brought down too, I don't know. But they took the team of horses up, because you certainly just carry this down, it's hundreds of pounds, and they brought this griststone as well as a smaller granite stone. This griststone Henry kept. The smaller granite stone that's not here today was the doorstep to my aunt's playhouse that my great-grandfather built for her. So I knew all about these stones, and so I think it's wonderful that we can share them. Right now they've been donated to the Acadian Museum at the University of Moncton, but we have been able to borrow them for our exhibit here and to share, because people want to see something real, and so they see this real artifact. I mean, it's just amazing. And to see where it actually had to come from. This is just a recent picture, but it was up the falls of Thibodeau Brook. Of course, we call it Tingley Brook because of Henry Tingley that lived next door. And so the mill was up here. There's nothing there today. This photo was taken by Paul Savoie, your brother, and there's nothing there. But we have had Thibodeaus from the United States and Ontario, and they walk up here, and it's a very, very emotional place to be, to know that, hey, this was where Pierre Thibodeau and his sons built the mill.
Well, that is very, very interesting. And you do it with so much passion that it's as if I'm hearing an Acadian speak. And that was very, very good. I think it's going to be a lot of interest on the part of people who are going to be watching the video. On the second question, you did a lot of work in the history of this region, and I guess I'd just like to have a little chat as to after the Acadians left, what happened here?
Okay. Well, after the Acadians were expelled and from the area, the British government had to form some way. They wanted settlers to come to this vacated land. So they came up with a plan that they would have private organizations or entrepreneurs be responsible for getting the settlers. So the first group, there was a group down in Pennsylvania. They called themselves the German Company, and there were about 4 or 5 that were involved in this. They were investors, you might say. Okay, and so they encouraged the German families to come. Now, it was quite a risk because they had to be responsible for getting the settlers. They had to make sure that they were going to fulfill the requirements and clear the land and so on. Otherwise, the government would take back the land. Okay, so it's interesting that the very first group in 1765, that was only 8 years after 1958, and as I read about that, I thought, can you imagine, here they were coming up the river, they would have seen the remains of the Acadian homes and the burned homes and what was left. So what was going through their minds as they were coming to this new land? And it was a risk for them too, because a lot of them, they knew nothing about diking and tidal lands and so on. So,
excuse me, do we know how many families were involved?
20. There were 20 families that came to what we call Germantown, and they had left Pennsylvania, and the place there was called Germantown, so that's probably the reason why they just renamed it again. So here they were, and Adam Hoops was the man, sort of the administrator, so to say. And so they came here, and it was, but they didn't get the provisions they needed. They didn't have tools or equipment or whatever, so you can imagine it was a very rough time for them, the hardships. Well, they struggled along, they started to complain, they complained to Halifax. We cannot live like this, we don't have what we need, to pretty much deaf ears, okay? So eventually, as in 1771, they had just had enough. And so they either went back to Pennsylvania, but some went to Hillsborough because another group had come to Hillsborough, and we all know in Hillsborough area the name Steves, that actually was a German name, Stief. So they had come up from Pennsylvania as well, and it was quite a group because there were the Stiefs and Lutzes and Trites and Summers, but they didn't go to Hillsborough at first. They landed at Halls Creek in Moncton.
Really?
Some people say, oh no, they came to Gray's Island and so on. No. First of all, they spent 2.5 years in the Moncton Township. And it was pretty rough there too. But there was an Acadian, his last name was Beliveau, and they think probably he had obviously escaped the deportation, and whether he was in Memramcook area or whatever, but he heard when they landed, he heard this, they were talking. They weren't talking English, they were talking something else. So he befriended them, because they were speaking German, and he taught them how to snare rabbits, how to fish, how to maple syrup, and so he really helped them in this rough time, because they had in fact, one winter, can you imagine eating turnip mush all winter? Yum. So they had a difficult time, but they heard about this group in Hillsborough who had settled there, and so they moved down. The Steeps moved down, Heinrich and Regina. We had Michael, I think it was the Trites, Lutz, and the Summers, and there were a few others. And in Hillsborough, there were 7 Acadian families that had remained, and they were living there as well. So it really started to prosper. They had, and he was fortunate because he got, you were supposed to get provisions and animals, so he had cattle, he had a bull, he had some pigs, so he did really, really well. And so pretty soon they were very, very prosperous. And the German families had increased to 28. The Acadian families had increased, I think it was, to 11. And there was a population of like 138 or something people. So, but, things never can go smoothly, can they? So in 1775, what happened to the Warrens' 13 colonies, and so you had these raiding vessels coming up the river, doing pillaging and plundering and everything, just like it had happened to the Acadians. So it's the same thing. So some, they retreated inland, some went to Fort Cumberland for safety, and some just stood their ground. There's a story about some of these rebels came into a house and they said, we're going to, we want a calf. I suppose they were hungry, and they took one of the calves and killed it and demanded that the wife cook it. And so anyway, at night they were sleeping, these rebels were sleeping, and her husband got an axe, and she's, so she, without her Christian attitude or whatever, do not kill these men, they might have had the axe taken to them. So, but that was the Hillsborough settlement was really, and of course today, the Steves, they're known worldwide. And in 1770 was the first time that his name was recorded, Heinrich Steves, instead of Stief. And of course the Steves have populated the, Albert County is known, Hillsborough especially, it was called Dutch Village for a long time, okay, because of the Germans.
Well, that's pretty well the story of them, the Germans there. But then other people came.
And so we also at the same time, in history it's hard to figure, you think, oh, it was happening there and it was separate from what was happening in the other section, but it wasn't, because at the same time, some of the English planters were also coming from Yorkshire. Okay, one group, well-known family in the Chipoudie area was the Peck family. Okay, the Peck Grant, they arrived again around 1765. They came up from, they came up from Massachusetts, but they went to Sackville, as always happened. They came from there to Nova Scotia over to Chipoudie area. So we had Abiel, or Abiel, however you want to say his name. So he was granted a large grant that took in all of what we have Riverside, Albert today, from the top of Hopewell Hill, all the way down to Chapman Creek, and again included the villages of Riverside, Albert. And he had, I think, 11 children, okay? And so he had come to, obviously, everyone wanted a new start, wanted whatever. The original Pioneer Cemetery you can still visit in Riverside, and he must have been quite a stalwart, ambitious man, because unfortunately he was drowned in a rowboat, but he was 73 years old, and he was rowing across the bay to Dorchester. So, I mean, that goes to show, and how rough it was. So we had the Peck Grant, and then other Yorkshire planters, and of course that was when probably my ancestors, the Wright family came. We had so many names that came at that time that are familiar names still found in Riverside, Albert.
So these people were Irish or
They were English.
English?
They were English. The Irish didn't come till a bit later, okay? So we had, like I said, they called the Yorkshire planters, and they obviously weren't familiar with the diking system and building the abattoir and so on, but they soon learned because some of the Acadians had, like we said, had remained, and they too were helping keep the abattoir system.
Speaking about the abattoirs, it would be a hard name for the English to pronounce. How would they call that?
Yes, I grew up as a little girl. My grandfather and my dad, they didn't say abattoir, they said bitos. So for years when I was little, I was calling them bitos. And then of course the dikes were really neat. They were these, big humps that kept the tidal waters out. And afterwards, to keep them up, they would hire the men in Chipoudie area. They would take their teams or their oxen, and we have lovely pictures of the men all standing with their diking spades and so on and working, keeping them up, because the marsh hay was the best. They exported the marsh hay, and I can remember coming home on a big load of soft hay, which today you don't get those loose hay, but riding up top, hanging on to the sort of the ladder thing, So that's why, when you have lived some of the history and you understand, mind you, times have changed. Now it's roll bale hay and so on. But yeah, and of course, I love the marsh. The marsh, you feel the salt air, smell the salt air. It's just a very wonderful habitat, and it's like no other. And of course we know it's important because it filters, It's a filtration system. And of course, hey, you can't be from Albert County if you don't like goose tongue greens. Cooked with a pork hock.
So these people then sort of settled there, and they were looking at being there permanently.
Yes, they were farmers, they lumbered, and they got to enjoy, and prosper from the marshlands and the clearing that had been done by the Acadians from 1700s.
So basically, did they adopt the same technology as the Acadians who were there before?
Yes, they did, because they kept up the dike work, and in fact, for years you helped pay your taxes off. If you went out and worked on the dikes and you took a team, then you got a credit for X number of dollars or how many hours that you spent. In fact, my grandfather, Harvey Wright, was one of the marsh keepers of records. I had some of his records in which he recorded how many hours everyone spent.
Is there any record of an early, for example, you mentioned earlier that there was a mill, it was a flour mill, I assume. Is there any record that they kept that mill and built some more? I don't know, maybe a lumber mill or something like that at that period?
At that period?
Yes.
Well, yes, they had to, every settlement had to have a mill, and even when I was talking about the Germans, one thing that brought success, that's another reason why Germantown didn't really succeed. They didn't have a sawmill because they wouldn't give the machinery to build a sawmill. They had no grist mill, so when they had their wheat, they had to take it a long distance to get it ground, so you had to have your grist mill, your sawmill, and then of course you had to have the knowledge of preservation of your food. And
so this looks like these people, the first settlers after the German, they sort of built the infrastructure. It's the building of the infrastructure of a community.
Well, I think they all worked together, and Hillsborough, because they were mostly German at that time, although there were some Acadians and there were some Irish too, and the Irish, some had sort of started to filter in, but the main Irish immigration didn't happen till early 1800s. In fact, in Albert County, the first recorded Irish settlement was in 1818, and of course they had come from Northern Ireland, trying to escape the persecution of the British, okay? And so they came to St. John, and they had it pretty rough right from the beginning, or very rough, because the only way for them to get to Albert County, because they landed in St. John, they had to walk. We called it the Immigrant Road, or the Chipoudie Road, that went from, probably be like a path at that time, from St. John, came up to Fundy Park, and the places where they settled in Fundy Park, and it was hard land to farm and so on. It was inland and hilly and so on. So some of the areas in Fundy Park, like Hastings, there was St. Clair Hills, there was Foster Brook, 45 Road, Tian's Corner, that area that now is Point Wolf, part of Fundy National Park, was settled by the Irish, and then of course New Ireland, that is very close to Riverside, Albert. There was a settlement there.
Do you have any idea how many families were involved at the beginning?
No, I don't know how many families, other than, well, quite a few, because there were 4 schools in New Ireland at one time. But we had named some of the names. There was Tians, the McKinleys, the their names just leave me, but so many of the family names around here, O'Hara's, and they had their own Catholic church, of course, St. Agatha's back in New Ireland, and so yes, in fact, there were a lot of Irish. In fact, I found from a research done by a cousin of mine who lives in Texas, that actually the Wright, I always believed that we came from England. We did not. We lived in Western Scotland, and we came here from Ireland. So
how did these families get along? Because, as you say, the Irish were coming from a situation where they were not very friendly with the English, and they found in this community, mainly English people heritage. So I assume they each had their church, that kind of thing. So in the community, it must have taken some doing to sort of blend that together.
You're right. Religion has always been a divisive thing, hasn't it?
Yes.
And so when you had, and what a good friend of mine, and she has done some writing for both the Irish. In fact, where the Thibodeau Monument is, there is the Irish monument there as well, okay? That what happened was that you had your Protestant Irish and your Catholic Irish. And so she said what happened is some of the Protestant Irish started moving out more to where, like in the Riverside, Albert area, okay? And it wasn't called Riverside and Albert at that time. But, and even into the 30s and 40s, families tried to keep, if you were Catholic, you were Protestant, tried to keep, they didn't condone marriages between the two, families and so on. But all in all, they did their own thing. They had to make a life, they had to work hard, and I don't know. And after a while, even the Irish in New Ireland had to, because times were changing.
Yeah.
And they started moving out. And
the occasions when they were here, they had the whole area was called Chipoudie. And then within those, in French they call them hameaux.
Yes.
They had the village, the Savoie, the village.
Yes. The Blanchard, so on.
They were the families sort of stuck together.
Yes. Yes.
Did that happen, something like that here, or were they more intermingled?
Well, like for instance, the Irish, they stuck together. In Hillsborough, you had the German families sticking together. I guess you might say that. I was just trying to thinking of a Chipoudie when you think of the families, but there were different denominations, and they seemed to all, respect each other. And
that was an extra challenge, because in the occasions they were all basically coming from the same place, they spoke the same language, they had the same religion.
Well, I guess the Peck, you would say, because they even called it Pecktown or Peckville, because all through Chipoudie, all that area, Hopewell Hill, whatever, if you look at a map, it's like all packed. Well, he's had 11 children, and as they had families and so on, and so, yeah, just like it was Tingling Town.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure. And we started out by saying that we wanted to know you better. I think we've done that very well, and I think we've benefited from the vast knowledge that you have, and also the passion that you're putting into this is really something.
Well, I'm not an expert by any means. It's just I have a passion because I'm very proud of where I grew up and I'm from, and proud of my family heritage. And I was actually honored to be included in your working group and help in some small way. And so we're looking forward to a great day on August the 16th. And like you said, it's for everyone. It's for everyone to celebrate this. It's not just for the Acadians to come and celebrate. It's like, if you're part, the history of the area, it goes way back. And we must not forget either the Mi'kmaq, the First Nations people who were here. You know, it's for everyone to celebrate.
Yes. Well, there we are. And thank you very much.